Good morning. My name is Tim McNeil. I am the Executive Director of the Genesis Counseling Center in Ormond Beach. For some of you, this would be our first time in meeting. I've had the opportunity to speak at this church, at least a dozen times in the last 10 years or so. So it's familiar for some of you and new for others, but having been the Executive Director of the Counseling Center for over 15 years now, there's bumper stickers I've seen in Port Orange that says, "Honk if you've been in counseling with Tim McNeil." If you haven't been, eventually you will be. And so I just wanted to have the opportunity to meet you now so you see that I don't have 6 legs and 4 arms. The Genesis Counseling Center is an outreach of our faith communities, not only to faith communities, but to the secular community as well. And so as an extension and outreach of the ministry of this church and other churches in the community, we appreciate your support and all that you do in helping make this ministry happen. Rather than to digress and to go extensively into all that's involved in the work of the Genesis Counseling Center, I chose instead that I wanted to bring you into a struggle that I've been wrestling with as it involves what it means to be the church. And oddly enough, I started giving some thought about this when I was watching the Today Show on July the 3rd. And they were happening to prep America for the international holiday for barbecuing, which is of course July the 4th. And there was a reporter who was reporting information that came from a Consumer Reports magazine that rated the hamburgers in America. And so their report gave the top 5 and also the worst 5. And on the top of the worst 5 was McDonald's. And once this was announced, the executives with McDonald's were not just loving it. The best burger went to a West Coast chain that's called In-N-Out Burger. Several years ago, we had the opportunity to go to Utah and see Bryce Canyon and Zion Canyon and enjoy those marvelous extensions of the Creator's fingerprint on the world in which He created. But fortunately or unfortunately, in order to do that, you have to fly in and out of Las Vegas. So having planned our trip, leaving and coming in between, we asked friends and family and polled the audience and asked if you were going to be in Lost Wages, what are the must-see places that you would go and see? And so they mentioned, the Bellagio and the Wyndham and the 5 different Circus du Soleil shows. And one friend of mine said, "You've got to go to the In-N-Out Burger." So we went. And it happened to be on a day that every other tourist had been told that they had to go to the In-N-Out Burger, because when we got there, mid-afternoon, the line was at the counter, all the way out the door, into the sidewalk, at 107-degree heat. They say it's not a really hot heat. They're really lying. It is hot. And, I thought we were backing up into Disney World, because the sign said it's an hour and a half for this ride before you get your hamburger. And so In-N-Out really implies, as you might suggest, speed. Something that's going to happen in a hurry. And this is very appealing to guys especially, because we like things to be done efficiently. So when we go to Target, we hit the stopwatch, because we want to beat our last time that we did when we went to Target, when you go in, purchase the item, and get back out in the car, sort of like a NASCAR pit stop. Or even, a Navy SEAL operation. You fly in on a helicopter, you have the mission, you back in the helicopter, and it's done. But in the church, this whole struggle about in and out means something entirely different. It means who's included and who gets excluded. And the history of the church pretty much has been involved in struggling with this theme in every generation. Who's in and who's out? And the question that defines that most readily is, are you saved? And so somebody who's asking, are you saved, is coming from the position of superiority, because in their mind they are saved, and the person who is the recipient of the question is not. In and out. And so what are the criteria to sort of engage and wrap our mind and our heart around? And when we look at the history of the church, there are three distinct issues that have come up over the last 2,000 years. And these are in no specific order, but rather just as they are. And the first one has to do with moral and ethical considerations. And when we look at the First Testament, when Moses received the Ten Commandments, from that point forward, it begins to expand. And so within the context of Judaism, in and out no longer is defined as far as who's in and who's out, but it then becomes an issue of clean and unclean. In the book of Leviticus, for example, there are, within all of the Old Testament, 613 rabbinical laws, but 247 of them can be found in the book of Leviticus. So once the law is given, the laws continue to expand more and more and more. And so by the time we get to the New Testament, Jesus summarizes all of the law in 2 commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. But from that point in time, we can look at Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 6, in which he begins to expand the list on moral and ethical considerations. And these scripture texts are listed in your bulletin, and if you like to dig deeper into that, you may so do. But Paul is already using the language of saints and unbelievers, in and out. And if the church had had as much time before the Bible closed its canon, I'm sure the New Testament would have had just as many rabbinical laws as Judaism did. The second criteria has to do with orthodoxy. And orthodoxy has to do with right belief. And so, defining the limits of orthodoxy, when we look back into the history of the church, the ancient creeds, the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed, were written to, at that point in time, to define the parameters of what we believe to be Orthodox faith. Issues that no longer are really considered so much in this day and age, but nevertheless defining components of wrestling with this issue of in and out. And so when we look at the latter part, moving into the 20th century, we can see the parameters of this that began and were surfaced in the fundamentalist movement. And the fundamentalist movement began in the 1920s when this group of people targeted Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was the pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in New York City. And later, over this controversy, he resigned, and where he went on to found Riverside Presbyterian Church in New York City, largely financed by the dollars of John D. Rockefeller. But the 5 criteria of contemporary fundamentalism have to do with the deity of the Christ, that he has and was of a divine nature, the virgin birth, the blood atonement, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and the inerrancy of the Scriptures. So the influence of modern fundamentalism is that if you don't adhere to or believe in these 5 points, then you are out. And then the last one has to do with what I call orthopraxy. And orthopraxy has to do with the right practice of the faith. And the right practice of the faith has to do with matters of the heart. And so if we had time, I would open up the book of Jeremiah and read verses 1 through 10. But Jeremiah was standing at the temple gate, and he was observing the worship of the people. And they would come into the temple, and they were using this phrase, "This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord." And it became a chant. And the people, you can imagine as if they were singing, "How great is thou God? Sing to me, how great is our God." That sense of worship and power gets repeated over and over, and people are raising their hands in praise and thanksgiving. And Jeremiah points out, you come into the temple and say, "This is the temple of our Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord," but then you go out and do these things. And so your behavior negates what you say you believe to be true about God. You lie, you steal, you withhold the weights and measures of how we balance buying grain, and so we cheat people on what they're paying for and what they're getting by weighing the scales in our favor. And if you do not practice hospitality to strangers, and so Jeremiah was pounding away that the people were saying one thing and doing another. Orthopraxy, the right practice of the faith. And so when we get down to where we are now, we wrestle with the issue of how did Jesus fare with these three things? Because when it came to his orthopraxy, you know that he spoke in the temple and in synagogue, and he unfolded in his first sermon the scroll. He read from the prophet Isaiah, and he said, "Now this has been fulfilled in your hearing." And they ran him out of town. So when Jesus is placed within the context of these three categories, he failed on every account. He failed on moral and ethical reasons, because from that point it becomes issues of how that was incongruent, because he ate with sinners and tax collectors. And so he was unclean. Failed. His accusers accused him of blasphemy. Would you please stop your disciples and your followers from saying that you are the Son of God? And blasphemy was one of the main charges of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, leveled against Jesus as to why he should be crucified. So he failed the orthodoxy test. And he failed the orthopraxy test because he healed on the Sabbath. So by these three criteria, Jesus couldn't even be a Christian. And so what do we do with this? Because, people who are on the outside tend to see things differently from those who are on the inside. Jesus was never going to get the golden ticket so that he could enter the chocolate factory. So what do we do with him? When I was growing up, we used to go to Valdosta, Georgia, and visit with my grandmother. And Nanny, as we called her, was a saint. And we would get into Valdosta, pull into the driveway. We would go in and give Nanny a hug and a kiss, and then we would go out to Johnny Sessions, who lived next door. Johnny Sessions was the neatest, coolest kid in the world. Johnny Sessions had more board games than anybody I'd ever knew. And if you want to know what a board game is, children, ask your grandparents. It was before video games.